Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. I'm joined now by Professor Anna Rowlands from Durham University, where she teaches politics and theology. Now, Anna has been involved in the synod process. Most recently, Anna was in Frascati, and as part of that process, all of the documents that people have been filling in all over the world were brought together. And the aim of many of those who came together in Frascati was to try and synthesize these. So no easy task. And Anna is going to share with us a little bit about her experience so far in being involved in this synod process. Anna, I know that you have done a huge amount of reading and a massive amount of work in this process. And that's probably a good place to start, is that I think some people might feel, well, is every submission really being read and really being absorbed? But you can attest to the fact that they are.
I can. I can tell you how utterly exhausted I was by the end of August, because we read every single submission, and not just the national submissions, which, by the way, were read 3 times over. So by 3 different people, each national submission was read, so that you couldn't just have sort of one individual interpretation of that. But in addition to all of the national submissions, we also read all of the Catholic group submissions that came in. And indeed, the Synod Office also received a huge number of individual submissions from all over the world that were actually quite moving. And those individual submissions were everything from people who really felt that the synod shouldn't be happening and were very critical of it, or assumed that it was a stitch-up, and that decisions were already being made, and that this was just an attempt to kind of roll out some kind of agenda on the church, and they wanted to write to resist that. We read all of those and we took those really seriously. But also there were ones from people who had maybe been estranged from the church for a very long time, particularly on the basis of something that had happened to them in the past, including obviously issues like abuse, but also maybe something that had happened in their families, that they had LGBT children, etc. And so those were really heartfelt individual submissions, and we took great care to read those as well. And then finally, there was also the digital synod, which lots of people don't realise existed. But the Vatican, for the first time, engaged Catholic influencers and a whole network of people who live primarily actually in a kind of digital world and realm, and are not necessarily in contact with parish life. And they got them to fill in questionnaires and responses as well. So we looked really carefully, and that was a way to get a younger demographic involved who maybe weren't so involved in parish groups and the national process.
So Anna, it really is a mammoth task that you had to take on in terms of trying to synthesize all the responses from countries all over the world. What struck you most about those international responses?
What was really striking about the documents is genuine diversity, including diversity of issues and diversity of ideas for how the church should perhaps change or move forward on those issues, renew its engagement with the world. So in some contexts, there was a real sense that what was challenging people was liturgy that was very dry. Ironically, one of the themes that came up actually across all contexts was bad homilies, was poor preaching, and the impact that that has on kind of engaging people in liturgical life and a sense of being spiritually fed. So that was there as a kind of really key agenda. The other that is a really connecting issue across contexts is really a sense that people don't feel that as family units, that they're accompanied through the changes and the dilemmas and the difficulties of their family lives. So a sense that the church is proximate to their ordinary everyday lives. And they wanted better formation for lay people, as well as better formation for clergy in understanding the reality of the kind of shape of family life in the age that we're living in. And that was true whether it was in Asia, so the Asian reports were really strong on family accompaniment and the lack of that, but also obviously in a kind of Northern Hemisphere context as well. There were then differences. So some contexts were worried in particular about issues of enculturation. So how the liturgy could be best enculturated into their local cultures and languages, where that hasn't really happened. And so that was really interesting, especially where there's strong Indigenous communities in an area. And obviously that was coming largely from a global South context. And then a strong emphasis on issues like war and violence. So really interestingly and movingly, we had submissions from Ukraine. So somehow the Ukrainian Catholic Church, in the midst of the violence that it's suffering at the moment, still managed to engage in the synod process. And then very late in the day, when we were actually at Frascati and we thought we wouldn't get it, we had a very moving submission from the Russian Church. So really the issues of war, violence, economic hardship took very different forms in different contexts in the world, as you would expect. But having said that, extraordinary parallels. People found joy in listening to each other. They also acknowledged that listening's quite hard once you start really trying to listen, especially across real differences and divides. It's actually a really hard thing to do. And yet, if you push through that pain barrier and find a way to deeply listen to each other, extraordinary things can happen in that space. And people told us, they wrote to us and they told us, and they wrote into their national reports some of the extraordinary things that happened when people sat and listened to each other across divided contexts. The Polish report talks really movingly about that, for example.
That idea of this big listening exercise and then being listened to seems to have been powerful. Is there going to be a practical kind of next step to some of these responses in terms of, well, this is information we know now, but what are we going to do with it?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting in the reports is that lots of national bishops' conferences and national synod groups identified the issues that they can get on with already, that they don't need Rome to wait and decide about, that they don't need the synod meeting in October this year and the following year to give them direction for. And the New Zealand report is brilliant at sort of setting out two different areas, a list of things which already can be done within the churches, and that includes things like better formation for homilies, better formation and education for priests, etc. But it also includes a list of things where they think, actually, we can't move ahead with these things because they have these are the things that rightly belong to the universal level of the church. And we need to have a conversation together about those kind of questions. So I think really helpfully, there are obvious things that have emerged just from already the fruits of the process, and there is movement on those. But then there are structural questions, universal questions, and that's what we're waiting on the 2 October meetings to move us forward on.
You mentioned, Anna, that there was obviously huge diversity and differences depending on the continent and the countries, but that there was striking parallels. What was the parallel that kind of jumped out to you the most or struck you the most?
I think there is a real sense that people feel that they have gifts that they want to offer, and that those gifts at the moment don't have an outlet. There isn't a way for them to offer to the church those gifts in their local communities and to have those recognised. So there's almost this tragic disconnect between a church that's desperate to reach out, to enlarge its tent, in the words of the document, and yet whole groups of people who are desperate to share their experience and their knowledge, to share their giftedness, and to build really vibrant Catholic communities. And how on earth you get a better connect so that all those gifts can flourish together, and there can be a deep renewal for the church. You know, those are the things that I think are really striking in the document. And I so hope that the process over the next 2 years is going to find ways to draw out that extraordinary giftedness that there is in the Catholic community, and enable it to be a whole community renewal event. And I think Francis has been really clever with the Synod. It's not about preset agendas. I don't know what decisions will come out from the next 2 years, even though I'm really deeply involved in the process. I have no idea. And yet I am confident that by starting with the grassroots and moving from the grassroots upwards, rather than starting from the centre and just cascading decisions down and hoping that they reach the base, I think that is animating a certain kind of genuine spirit in the church, and the energy from that, if it can really be captured and worked with, will be one that bears fruit, you know, over decades, not merely over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and as you've touched on there, if people can do what Pope Francis has asked to do, ask the question, where is the Spirit leading us in this process? And putting aside, in a way, we have to be so humble with that, because obviously we have our own desires and, you know, what we think should happen, etc. But it's, where is the Spirit leading us? And I think a lot of people, Anna, will be so encouraged to hear people want their church to survive and to thrive. You know, that is a real desire, and I think that's so encouraging. I know one of the other issues that seems to have come across very strongly across borders is the role of women in the church. What was your impression of that as you read through all of these documents?
Well, again, I had expected there to be something in the reports that touched on the question of the role of women, just based on my own lived experience as a Catholic for my whole life. I just expected some of that to be there. What I didn't expect is that virtually every report had quite substantive things to say about the experience of women, and that would have an inner diversity to it. That wasn't like a kind of a disagreement or a fight or an argument, but was simply the revealing of a diversity of experiences and views in the church about what might need to be done to address better the question of the participation of women. So the first thing to say is that this wasn't about rights language. It wasn't about we have a right to X or Y and we wish to claim that right. It was much more, and this is the language we used in the document in the end, the dignity of all of the baptized, and the question about whether the dignity of women is genuinely fully recognised and fully realised in the church as members of the common body of the baptized. So that became almost like the theological framework for thinking about the many contributions on women. And then the second thing I'd say is the two main ways in which women emerged in the reports was inside the church questions about the dignity of the baptized and outside external church questions about the dignity of the baptized. And the external questions, which were very often in the reports from the Global South, were about the economic challenges and the social challenges and the political challenges that women face in their lives. And the question about whether the church deeply understands the impact of those challenges and those forms of marginalization, and whether it's capable of exercising leadership by drawing alongside women to better understand how these issues and realities shape their lives. So in the document, we use the word ally, which actually doesn't always translate well across other languages, because in other languages, ally can make it sound like a sort of trade agreement between countries. But obviously in English, we use it to mean a kind of form of friendship and accompaniment. So can the church learn how to be an ally in the lives of women, particularly on questions of war and violence, which we know have a particular gendered effect on women's lives, the lives of women and also of children? And can they face some of the realities of how the economic system in different parts of the world affects women's lives? So there was a big question about, can the church step up to that challenge in a way that currently it does, but often in a piecemeal way and without that depth of understanding, and recognizing that women are already leading the way in their cultures on striving for change on those issues. But is the church always there by the side of women as they're doing that? And then the second area was much more about the recognition of the skills and the giftedness and the talent of women inside the church, whether it's possible to have women participating in governance structures, in creative forms of lay ministry and so forth, in a way that truly enables the church to flourish and to meet the needs, the spiritual needs of a new generation.
I think it's probably something people are going to be really thinking about, Anna, that there has been this parallel in terms of the role of women, but imagining that it's so different for a woman in the Global South, as you say, as it might be for women like you and I in the West, that that point that you're making of the church being an ally and really living out the Christian teaching of we are all known and loved equally, you know, men and women by God. And that needs to be borne out in society too. And it's not happening in many cultures across the world, of course.
No, that's true. And I do think also I should be clear that there are raised in the reports, there are real issues about in our own very wealthy Western Northern Hemisphere context, the kind of choices that women have to make in their own lives, that broadly speaking, I, as a university professor, do not have to make, but were choices that my grandparents who left Ireland as economic migrants in their teens did have to make, and women still are making in my context now. So the reality is that these are not only Global South issues, and sometimes these are hidden issues within church communities. And what Pope Francis has asked us to do is, no matter where we live, there are peripheries within our communities. There are those who are making silent choices on a daily basis about how they feed their children, how they survive economically. And we need to be able to better understand the ways in which women in particular end up feeling like they have to make certain choices in those moments. So yes, Global South really key to that, but actually there are peripheries within our own global North centres as well. And is the church alongside women who are existing on those peripheries?
It strikes me as we're talking about this particular issue that obviously in many ways it's complicated and there's so many layers to it. But is the answer also simple in that we just need to be more like Jesus and live out our ministry in the same way as he did?
Yeah, I mean, there was a moment, I won't say who it was, but a very senior cleric who was involved in the process said very simply to us in Frascati, you know, you read these national reports and you think to yourself, people just want a church that feels and looks a little bit like the Jesus of the Gospels. They want us to look and feel like Jesus. And if they see that integrity in the way that we live and the way that we worship, then actually that is a deeply attractional thing. And I think a key part of Pope Francis's message overall of his pontificate has been, we will draw people to the church if the life that we live is perceived to be deeply attractive, that it has a goodness and a vitality and a truth at its heart. And he's often tried to communicate that less through words and more through gestures, so that people see that as a tangible reality and judge for themselves. But in a simple form, that's what he wants from the synod process. He wants a renewal of the church so it looks and feels like the reality of touching and feeling and being in contact with the living Christ, the Jesus of the Gospels.
Well, Anna, it has been uplifting and educating just chatting to you about the work that you have been doing as part of the Synod process. We thank you for your time and we'll be praying for you as the process continues. Professor Anna Rowlands, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for joining us on iCatholic today. Thanks so much for joining us on iCatholic today. Please make sure that you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.